Have you ever had a moment, just a fleeting second, when everything around you felt empty? You've worked tirelessly to climb the ladder of success, achieved what you once thought were your deepest desires, and surrounded yourself with the comforts of life. Yet, deep inside, there's this gnawing sensation that no matter how much you gain, the joy you expected to feel is never quite there. The richer you get, the emptier you feel. The more accomplishments you rack up, the less satisfying they seem. Have you ever wondered, is this it? Is this all there is to life? If this resonates with you, you're not alone. In fact, it's one of the most profound and terrifying realizations that anyone can experience. It's a feeling that many people, including some of the most celebrated minds in history, have grappled with: nihilism, a belief that no matter what we do or how we live, life is inherently meaningless. You might have everything the world says you should want: money, love, success, and recognition, but still feel an overwhelming sense of emptiness. It's as if you're going through the motions, achieving milestones, but nothing truly fills the void inside you. Imagine waking up one day, surrounded by the trappings of wealth, surrounded by a loving family, with achievements stacked high, and yet you feel nothing. No happiness, no fulfillment, just a vast, yawning emptiness. This is the experience of nihilism. Nihilism isn't a grand philosophical theory that you consciously study or decide to follow. It's more like an uninvited guest that sneaks into your life when you least expect it. One day, everything seems fine. You're doing well. You feel proud of your accomplishments, your relationships, and your status in life. But suddenly, a voice begins to ask, is all this really worth it? Does it even matter in the grand scheme of things? And that's where the terrifying realization sets in. Nihilism isn't a concept you can easily ignore. It challenges the very fabric of how you've come to understand your existence. It makes you question everything, including the idea that any of your achievements, desires, or even life itself has any real meaning. In this video, we are going to explore one of the most poignant and unsettling experiences of existential despair, the onset of nihilism, and how even those who seem to have it all aren't immune to its chilling grasp. To truly understand the depth of this crisis, we need to look at how it affected one of the most renowned writers in history, Leo Tolstoy, and how his personal confrontation with nihilism led him down a path that would forever change his understanding of life, death, and the search for meaning. Leo Tolstoy, the author of monumental works like War and Peace and Anna Karenina, was not just a man of literature. He was a man of status, wealth, and influence, a man who had everything the world could offer. And yet, one day, he was struck by the sudden and terrifying awareness that everything he had, everything he was, meant nothing in the end. This moment of clarity didn't come to him in the form of an external crisis. There was no death of a loved one, no catastrophic event, no immediate disaster. Rather, it was a quiet, internal storm, a gradual sinking feeling that led him to question everything about the world, about life, and about his very existence. At the height of his success, Tolstoy began to ask, what is the point of all this? What is the point of my writing, my fame, my fortune? What is the point of life itself if we are all destined to die? And if all our actions and efforts are eventually lost to time? It was a question that consumed him, and, like a heavy fog, it obscured everything that once brought him joy. This was the moment that began his famous existential crisis. The man who had written some of the greatest novels in human history found himself paralyzed by the belief that all human endeavors were meaningless, that nothing, neither art, nor love, nor labor mattered in the grand sweep of existence. Tolstoy's experience was not unique. Many people, perhaps even some of you watching this video, have encountered nihilism in their own lives. It might not come with the same dramatic flair or intellectual grandeur as Tolstoy's experience, but it sneaks up on you just the same. It might show up as a quiet dissatisfaction, a sense that despite everything you've accomplished, something is still missing. Or it might hit you all at once like a punch in the gut when you realize that everything you've worked for, everything you've thought you wanted, is ultimately fleeting. And in that moment, you're left with the overwhelming, gut-wrenching question, what's the point? This is what makes nihilism so unsettling. It robs you of the very foundation of meaning that you've built your life upon. We are taught, from an early age, to pursue success, happiness, and fulfillment. These are the goals that society sets for us, the markers that tell us we're on the right path. But what happens when you realize that none of it really matters? That, at the end of the day, life is just a series of fleeting moments and inevitable losses. The question of meaning is an age-old one, and it's a question that Tolstoy's journey can help us explore. In his search for answers, he did what many of us would do. He turned to philosophy, religion, and his own experiences, and in doing so, he uncovered something profound, something that many of us can relate to, even if we're not grappling with the full existential crisis that he endured. The question that plagued Tolstoy is the very same question that many of us must confront in our own lives. What is the meaning of life? What makes it worth living? In today's video, we're going to look at Tolstoy's crisis in depth, and we'll see how his confrontation with nihilism led him down a philosophical path that included not just intellectual inquiry, but also a deep exploration of faith, spirituality, and personal meaning. We'll examine the ways in which nihilism challenges us to rethink everything about our lives, from the work we do, to the relationships we form, to the very way we understand happiness and fulfillment. But perhaps even more importantly, we will talk about how to confront nihilism, how to find meaning in a world that often feels like it's devoid of it. Because while nihilism might feel like a terrifying abyss, it's not the end of the road. In fact, it might just be the beginning of a much deeper and more profound journey into understanding who we are, what we value, and why we choose to live the way we do. Before we dive deeper into Tolstoy's journey, let's consider what nihilism really means. Nihilism is not just a philosophical idea, it's a feeling, an experience that many people go through. It's that moment when everything you once believed in suddenly feels irrelevant, when life itself feels like a vast, uncaring void. But it's important to note that nihilism doesn't necessarily mean despair. It doesn't have to lead to hopelessness or inaction. It's a confrontation with reality, a cold, uncomfortable realization that everything we think we know about the world might be wrong. But the very act of confronting it can open up new possibilities, new ways of thinking, and ultimately, new paths toward finding meaning. Tolstoy's experience of nihilism wasn't a simple or straightforward one. It wasn't something he could just shake off or ignore. It shook him to his core, and it challenged everything he had ever known. But through that crisis, he found something that millions of people throughout history have found, a new understanding of life that transcended material wealth, worldly success, and even intellectual achievement. So, as we explore this journey with Tolstoy, we'll also ask ourselves, how does nihilism shape our lives? And, more importantly, how can we move beyond it? The answers to these questions may not be easy, but they are necessary if we are to live truly meaningful lives. Let's dive in and see how one of the greatest minds in history dealt with the terrifying realization that life might be meaningless. And perhaps, in the process, we'll discover something about our own lives. 2. At the peak of his fame and success, Leo Tolstoy, the legendary author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, found himself engulfed in an existential crisis that shook him to his very core. This crisis wasn't brought on by any external tragedy or sudden loss, but rather by a quiet, insidious realization that life, despite all of its apparent rewards and pleasures, might ultimately be devoid of meaning. It was a crisis not of intellect, but of soul, a crisis that made him question not just his own existence, but the very nature of life itself. It was in the midst of his greatest achievements that Tolstoy found himself grappling with a feeling that many people, even today, wrestle with: the gnawing, disquieting emptiness that arises when one begins to question the true value of their accomplishments, their relationships, and, most devastatingly, their very reason for living. At this time, Tolstoy was living a life that most people could only dream of. He had written 2 of the greatest novels in literary history, works that would endure for centuries and shape the course of Russian literature. He was a member of the Russian aristocracy, a man of wealth and influence, living in a beautiful estate with a loving family. He had achieved the highest levels of success in his field, and yet, paradoxically, he felt more disconnected from life than ever before. The sense of emptiness was not caused by any external loss or disaster, but by the suffocating realization that the things he had devoted his life to, the very pursuits that had once seemed so full of promise, felt suddenly hollow. His career, his fame, his family, even his beloved country estate, all of it seemed trivial in the face of this overwhelming feeling of meaninglessness. The books that had made him world famous, books that had captured the hearts and minds of millions, now seemed to him like empty words on a page. His accomplishments, which had once filled him with pride and purpose, now seemed irrelevant in the face of the vast, unfathomable universe. Tolstoy began to see his life through a lens that was both chilling and revelatory. No matter how many successes he achieved, no matter how much wealth and prestige he amassed, none of it seemed to make a difference. In fact, the more he achieved, the more disconnected he became. The desire for recognition, for more accomplishments, seemed to grow, yet it was never enough to fill the gaping hole inside him. Nothing could satisfy the hunger for meaning that had suddenly consumed him. This crisis was not a fleeting moment of doubt, but a profound and lasting existential questioning that Tolstoy could not escape. He had always been a deeply reflective person, a man who wrestled with big ideas and grappled with questions about life, death, and the human condition. But now, those questions seemed to take on a new urgency and a new depth. His mind, once consumed with the act of writing, now turned inward, obsessed with the question that had begun to haunt him. What was the point of it all? What was the purpose of life, of achievement, of fame, if everything ultimately came to an end and was forgotten? It was at this point that Tolstoy encountered the idea of nihilism, a philosophy that would shape his thinking during this time of crisis. Nihilism, at its core, is the belief that life has no inherent meaning or purpose. It's the idea that all of our efforts, our achievements, our desires, and even our very existence are ultimately meaningless in the grand scheme of things. Tolstoy describes this feeling as a kind of terrifying clarity, a moment of profound awareness that stripped away the comforting illusions he had built his life upon. In this state of clarity, the world, once so full of beauty and wonder, suddenly seemed repellent. Everything that had once seemed important, his writing, his family, his wealth, now appeared like empty distractions from the cold, harsh truth of existence. This realization was not brought on by any external tragedy or catastrophe. It was not the result of a personal loss or a traumatic event. Instead, it was a quiet, creeping awareness that gradually overtook him, forcing him to confront the possibility that nothing in life had any real meaning. The more Tolstoy pondered this idea, the more the void inside him seemed to widen. It was not just that his personal achievements seemed empty, but that life itself, in its entirety, seemed to have no inherent purpose. In the face of this stark realization, Tolstoy found himself questioning not just the meaning of his own life, but the very meaning of human existence. For Tolstoy, this crisis was deeply unsettling, but it was also deeply philosophical. He was not the first, nor the last, person to confront the question of meaning in a world that often seems indifferent to human suffering and striving. In fact, many of the greatest thinkers in history have grappled with this same question. Philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche and Soren Kierkegaard, for example, have written extensively about the existential void, the sense that life is inherently meaningless and that our search for meaning is often futile. For Nietzsche, the answer to this crisis lay in the creation of one's own meaning, in embracing life's challenges and affirming one's existence despite the apparent meaninglessness of it all. For Kierkegaard, the answer was found in a leap of faith, a belief in God that transcended rational thought and embraced the mystery of existence. Tolstoy, however, was not so quick to jump to conclusions. His response to nihilism was not to create his own meaning or to simply embrace faith without question. Instead, his crisis led him to a much deeper search for answers. He began to question the very foundations of his life, his career, his family, his beliefs, and to confront the possibility that everything he had taken for granted might be illusory. This period of intense self-reflection led him to explore different avenues for finding meaning, including religion, philosophy, and spirituality. Tolstoy's journey into the depths of nihilism ultimately led him to a spiritual awakening. It was through his exploration of Christian faith and his attempt to live a life of simplicity and purpose that he began to find meaning once again. His existential crisis pushed him toward a radical rethinking of what it meant to live a good and meaningful life. He abandoned much of his former lifestyle, his wealth, his privileges, his aristocratic lifestyle in favor of a life of humility, service, and devotion to others. This shift marked the beginning of his transformation into a spiritual seeker, a man who would spend the rest of his life searching for a deeper understanding of human existence and our place in the world. Tolstoy's existential crisis was not just a personal struggle, it was a philosophical and spiritual awakening. His experience offers a powerful illustration of the human condition, of the ways in which success and fame can often lead to feelings of emptiness and alienation. It highlights the limitations of materialism and the search for external validation, and it challenges us to reconsider what truly matters in life. Tolstoy's crisis was not an isolated experience. In fact, it is a universal theme that has been explored by countless writers, thinkers, and philosophers throughout history. The search for meaning is one of the fundamental aspects of the human experience, and it is a struggle that continues to resonate with people today. In the end, Tolstoy's journey through nihilism led him to a profound and enduring understanding of the nature of existence. He came to realize that while life may not have inherent meaning, it is still possible to find purpose through love, compassion, and service to others. Tolstoy's crisis ultimately transformed him into a man who lived for something greater than himself, a man who sought to find meaning not in fame or wealth, but in the ways in which he could contribute to the well-being of others. His experience is a reminder that the search for meaning is not always easy, but it is an essential part of what it means to be human. Tolstoy's existential crisis illustrates a fundamental truth, that the more we achieve, the more we risk confronting the emptiness that lies beneath the surface of our lives. It is a reminder that the pursuit of external success and validation can only take us so far. At some point, we must turn inward and ask ourselves what truly matters. For Tolstoy, the answer came not in the form of intellectual achievements or worldly success, but in the quiet, humble pursuit of a life of purpose and meaning, a life defined not by fame or fortune, but by love, service, and compassion. This realization is both a warning and an invitation. A warning that the pursuit of external success can lead us down a path of emptiness, and an invitation to look deeper, to search for meaning that transcends the superficial trappings of life. Imagine this: you've worked for years, tirelessly pushing yourself to achieve the dream. You've been through the grind, endless meetings, sleepless nights, and moments where it felt like you couldn't go on, but now, finally, you've arrived. You have it all: a sprawling house, the luxury car you've always wanted, financial freedom that allows you to buy anything you desire. You can travel the world, dine in the finest restaurants, and enjoy the best that life has to offer. You've achieved everything society tells you is important. So, why is it that instead of feeling at peace, you feel restless? The constant urge to chase the next big thing gnaws at you. You buy more, you achieve more, but the emptiness only grows. You thought that with all your success would come fulfillment. Yet here you are, caught in a trap. No matter how much you acquire, satisfaction seems just out of reach. This feeling of perpetual dissatisfaction is the heart of the existential crisis. It's that moment when it dawns on you that the things you thought would bring you happiness, success, wealth, fame don't actually do so. The more you gain, the less it feels like it matters. The emptiness grows even as your material wealth increases. This, in essence, is the trap of desire. This crisis is not just the stuff of fiction or philosophical thought experiments. It's a very real experience for many people today, and it has been the subject of intense reflection by some of history's greatest thinkers. One such person who went through an existential crisis of his own, one that has some striking parallels to the modern experience, is Leo Tolstoy, the famous Russian novelist who had everything a man could ask for, and yet found himself grappling with the most profound question of all. What's the point? Tolstoy's life seemed, from the outside, to be the epitome of success. He was an aristocrat, a famous author whose works like War and Peace and Anna Karenina are considered among the greatest novels ever written. He had a beautiful family, wealth, and influence. In fact, Tolstoy achieved the very things that most people dream of, things that many think will bring happiness and fulfillment. Yet, as Tolstoy got older and enjoyed the fruits of his success, something changed. The more he had, the less it seemed to matter. He was not alone in this feeling. This is the essence of the existential crisis. The moment when the things you've worked for, the dreams you've chased, the desires you've fulfilled, leave you feeling empty. For Tolstoy, the realization that his life might ultimately be meaningless came gradually. It wasn't a single event that triggered his crisis, but rather a slow, creeping awareness that no matter how much he achieved, the satisfaction he expected never came. His fame and wealth couldn't fill the void within him. The works he had created, novels that would be remembered for centuries, seemed trivial in the face of the vast, unfathomable nature of life and death. The success he once thought would define him seemed insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And here, Tolstoy faced the ultimate question. If none of these things could bring him true happiness or meaning, what was the point of it all? This is exactly what many people today experience, albeit in a more modern form. The entrepreneur with the massive house, the luxury car, the financial freedom is an updated version of Tolstoy, facing the same existential dilemma. Despite achieving everything he once thought he wanted, he finds himself feeling just as empty as he did before, only now with more stuff and more responsibility. The hustle continues because the void inside has only grown bigger. In Tolstoy's case, the deeper he looked into the nature of his desires, the clearer it became that the pursuit of material success was not the answer to the question of life's meaning. He had climbed the ladder of achievement, but when he reached the top, he found that the view wasn't as satisfying as he had expected. The more he acquired, the more he realized that it wasn't the external world that could satisfy his internal yearning. It was something deeper, something more spiritual. But the struggle was real. How do you make sense of it all when the things you've spent your whole life pursuing suddenly feel unimportant? This is the nature of the trap of desire. It promises fulfillment but never delivers. Each new goal, each new acquisition, is like a temporary fix, a fleeting moment of satisfaction that quickly fades away, leaving you wanting more. The cycle repeats itself. Desire leads to acquisition, but acquisition only leads to new desires. It's an endless loop that ultimately leaves you feeling unfulfilled. And this sense of dissatisfaction is what many philosophers have written about for centuries. The existentialists, in particular, have been obsessed with this problem, recognizing that the pursuit of meaning through material success is an illusion. Think of it this way: the trap of desire is like a hungry beast that can never be fed. No matter how much you give it, it's never enough. You might think that the next thing will be the thing that finally satisfies it, whether it's a new car, a new promotion, or a new relationship. But when you get it, the satisfaction is fleeting, and then the desire begins again. This is exactly what Tolstoy encountered in his own life. At the height of his success, he found that the more he achieved, the emptier he felt. Fame, wealth, and family, things that should have made his life complete, now seemed to him like distractions from the greater question of existence. He came to see that no matter how much he achieved in life, it couldn't fill the spiritual emptiness he was experiencing. He began to ask the question that lies at the heart of every existential crisis. What is the point of it all? The question is not just about material success. Of course, it's about the deeper question of why we're here, what we're supposed to be doing, and what gives our lives meaning. Tolstoy, in his existential crisis, found himself grappling with these very questions. In a world that often measures success by wealth, status, and accomplishments, he realized that these things couldn't answer the deeper question of life's purpose. He had lived according to society's expectations, achieving all the things that were supposed to make him happy. But when the applause died down and the dust settled, he was left with the same question: what now? For Tolstoy, the answer came not in more accomplishments or more possessions. but in something far simpler: the search for deeper meaning through faith and spirituality. His crisis, in a way, was a catalyst for his spiritual awakening. He turned inward, away from external success and material gain, and sought a life that was more aligned with the true meaning of existence, one that wasn't measured by possessions or public acclaim, but by love, service to others, and the pursuit of something transcendent. And this is where the parallel to modern life becomes apparent. The entrepreneur's crisis of meaning is not a unique experience, it's one that can be found in countless people's lives today. We live in a world where success is often defined by external markers: wealth, status, achievements. But for many, these markers of success fail to provide lasting happiness or fulfillment. The more they acquire, the less they feel satisfied. And in this pursuit of more, many find themselves questioning, what is the point? Is there more to life than what we see on the surface? Tolstoy's journey, like that of the modern entrepreneur, illustrates the futility of chasing endless desires. It shows us that the pursuit of external markers of success, whether it's fame, wealth, or power, will never provide lasting fulfillment. In fact, it might even make the emptiness feel worse. The trap of desire is a powerful force, but it is ultimately empty. The true meaning of life, as Tolstoy discovered, is not found in what we acquire or achieve, but in how we live, how we love, and how we serve others. This is the lesson at the heart of Tolstoy's crisis. The more we focus on external success and the pursuit of worldly desires, the more we risk losing sight of what truly matters. Real fulfillment, Tolstoy learned, comes not from achieving more or acquiring more, but from understanding that life's meaning is found in the small, everyday acts of kindness, love, and service. And in that realization lies the key to breaking free from the trap of desire and finding a deeper, more lasting sense of fulfillment. Leo Tolstoy, like so many before and after him, faced the daunting and often terrifying realization that life might be inherently meaningless. At the peak of his success, with fame, wealth, and a loving family, he found himself staring into a void and emptiness that not even the accomplishments of a lifetime could fill. In his most profound moments of reflection, he came to understand something essential about the human condition. Nihilism, the belief that life has no inherent meaning or value, is not a condition that only affects a few. It can strike anyone, especially those who seem to have everything. It is a universal problem, one that will inevitably confront many of us at some point. But how do we respond to the realization that life might have no inherent meaning? How do we grapple with the existential weight that Tolstoy, and countless others, faced in their darkest hours? Tolstoy identifies four primary responses that people have when confronted with nihilism. These are responses that he himself struggled with, and in doing so, his reflections offer us valuable insight into how we might navigate similar crises in our own lives. The first response to nihilism is ignorance, the temptation to simply turn a blind eye to the growing sense of dread. It is, perhaps, the most common response, and also the most comforting, when faced with the profound realization that nothing ultimately matters. It's only natural to want to shut it out. Some people try to bury their existential concerns under the weight of daily distractions. They might throw themselves into work, dive into entertainment, or become preoccupied with mindless pleasure. This approach is deeply human, as it allows us to avoid confronting the uncomfortable reality of our own existential doubt. In the short term, it can be effective. People can go about their lives, enjoying their routines and their distractions, and for a time, the void seems manageable. But Tolstoy understood something fundamental. Once the existential crisis is acknowledged, it cannot be ignored forever. Ignorance may work temporarily, but eventually, the question of meaning will rear its head again. As Tolstoy himself discovered, you cannot unsee the emptiness once it has been revealed. To continue on as though everything is fine, pretending that life has meaning when you've already glimpsed its meaninglessness, is a form of self-deception. It's a dangerous kind of ignorance, because while it may shield us from the discomfort of facing nihilism, it ultimately leaves us spiritually unfulfilled and unable to confront the deeper questions of existence. The second response Tolstoy identifies is hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure as a means of filling the void. If life is meaningless, the logic goes, then the only thing left to pursue is personal gratification. Hedonism is, in many ways, the antithesis of ignorance. While ignorance seeks to distract us from our existential concerns, hedonism embraces them head-on, but only in the form of an escape. It's an attempt to find meaning in the fleeting satisfaction of physical pleasure. People dive into indulgence, whether it's food, material possessions, or sexual experiences, believing that these will bring fulfillment in a world that seems otherwise devoid of it. But Tolstoy, who had tasted the pleasures of fame and wealth, understood the ultimate futility of this path. He realized that no matter how intense the pleasure, it was never lasting. The more one chases after pleasure, the more elusive it becomes. Pleasure, by its very nature, is fleeting. It might bring temporary satisfaction, but it is never enough to quell the deeper existential yearning. In fact, the more one indulges, the less satisfying these pleasures become, until they eventually feel hollow. What once brought joy turns into a monotonous cycle, leaving the individual still searching for something that will fill the emptiness. Tolstoy points out that hedonism, while an understandable response to nihilism, ultimately exacerbates the problem. It never offers real, lasting fulfillment. The chase for pleasure becomes a never-ending treadmill, and the momentary highs of satisfaction are always followed by the familiar descent into emptiness. This brings us to the third response, despair or self-destruction. For some, when confronted with the meaninglessness of life, the weight of that realization becomes unbearable. It leads to a sense of hopelessness, and in extreme cases, can push people towards self-destructive behavior or even suicide. This response is tragic but real, and it is one of the most devastating consequences of existential crises. When everything seems pointless, when the very foundation of one's existence feels shaky, it is understandable that some people might fall into despair. They may feel that there is no way out of the void, no way to reconcile the inherent meaninglessness of life with the desire for purpose and fulfillment. Tolstoy himself experienced this kind of despair. He went through a period where he questioned everything: his work, his family, his very existence. He described moments of such deep despair that he wondered if life was worth living at all. But even in the depths of despair, Tolstoy recognized that there was still a search for meaning. It was a dark search, one that led him to question whether death was the only answer to the problem of life's meaninglessness. But as he eventually discovered, this response, though tragic, is also a sign of a deeper yearning for meaning. The despair, in a sense, is a cry for help, a desperate search for something to hold on to in a world that feels empty. The final response to nihilism that Tolstoy describes is inertia, the quiet, soul-deadening continuation of life without joy, purpose, or meaning. This is perhaps the most insidious response of all, because it is the one that so many people fall into without ever fully realizing it. Inertia is the act of going through the motions of life, day after day, without any sense of purpose or fulfillment. People who experience inertia may not actively despair or indulge in pleasure, but they continue to live out their routines because it is what they have always done. They keep working, raising their families, and maintaining social relationships. But all of this is done without any real belief in the significance of these actions. They are, in a sense, dead inside, disconnected from the deeper meaning of life. Tolstoy experienced this state of inertia during some of his darkest moments. Even though he was living a full life, one that included his family, his writing, and his position in society, he felt spiritually hollow. His work no longer seemed meaningful. His relationships felt shallow, and his very existence felt like an exercise in futility. He went through the motions of life, but there was no joy or satisfaction in it. This soul death, as Tolstoy described it, is perhaps the most tragic form of nihilism, because it represents a life that continues outwardly but has lost its inner vitality. It's a form of existential numbness, a state in which a person continues living but is disconnected from the true essence of existence. Tolstoy's four responses to nihilism: ignorance, hedonism, despair, and inertia are not just abstract concepts from his personal life. They are responses that many of us can relate to, responses that we may have experienced ourselves, even if only in fleeting moments. Nihilism, after all, is not something that affects only a select few. It is a part of the human condition, one that arises when we realize that the things we value, the things we spend our lives chasing, might ultimately be empty. But Tolstoy's journey also provides us with a kind of roadmap for moving beyond nihilism. Through his own search for meaning, he discovered that it wasn't the pursuit of material success or pleasure that would offer fulfillment. Rather, it was a deeper, more spiritual understanding of life's purpose, a purpose that could be found in love, faith, and service to others. For Tolstoy, the answer to nihilism wasn't to deny the emptiness of life, but to embrace it as an invitation to search for something more meaningful. In the end, he found that true fulfillment comes not from achieving more or acquiring more, but from understanding and accepting the impermanence of life and dedicating oneself to the things that truly matter: love, compassion, and a connection to something greater than oneself. In Confession, Leo Tolstoy takes the reader deep into the heart of his own existential crisis, confronting the void that accompanies the realization that life may, in fact, have no inherent meaning. The story of his personal struggle is one that resonates with anyone who has ever questioned the very purpose of their existence. At the height of his fame and success, Tolstoy, who had achieved almost everything that society deems valuable wealth, status, a family, found himself faced with a terrifying realization. The more he had, the less fulfilled he felt. No amount of fame, wealth, or literary accomplishment could shield him from the gnawing emptiness he experienced. In his moments of deepest despair, Tolstoy turned to the question of faith. Could faith in something greater, something beyond the scope of human reason, provide the answer to the meaninglessness he was grappling with? Could belief in a higher power offer a solution to the existential despair that had consumed him? These are the very questions that Tolstoy explores in Confession. And they are questions that have occupied philosophers, religious thinkers, and ordinary people alike for centuries. However, Tolstoy's struggle with faith is not a simple or easy one. He is a man of deep intellect, someone who has spent his life grappling with ideas, philosophies, and the rationality of human existence. For a long time, he found it difficult, even impossible, to accept the traditional religious beliefs that he had been raised with. How could he, a man who had spent years studying the world, come to believe in something that seemed, at least on the surface, to be irrational and beyond reason? To will himself into belief was, for Tolstoy, an impossible task. Faith, for him, was not something that could be conjured up through sheer willpower or intellectual commitment. And yet, as he wrestled with his despair, he began to observe something profound in the lives of the Russian peasantry, people who, despite enduring extreme hardship and suffering, seemed to find meaning in their lives through their faith. These simple folk, with their unwavering belief in God and in a higher purpose, appeared to live lives filled with hope. Even in the face of adversity, their faith provided them with a sense of meaning and purpose that Tolstoy, with all his intellectual accomplishments, seemed to lack. As he watched them, he began to wonder, could faith really provide the answer to his existential crisis? This question, the role of faith in overcoming nihilism, is one of the most important that Tolstoy grapples with in Confession, and it is a question that continues to be central to discussions of existential despair. If life is meaningless, if we are just finite beings in a vast, indifferent universe, then what is the point of living? Can faith in something greater than ourselves provide an antidote to the emptiness we feel when we realize that nothing in the world may truly have inherent meaning? Is faith a solution to nihilism, or is it merely another form of self-deception, a way of avoiding the brutal reality of life's inherent meaninglessness? Tolstoy's own experience provides a unique perspective on this question. In the beginning, he rejects the idea that faith could provide a real solution to his despair. He is not interested in simple piety or religious ritual. He cannot accept the dogmatic answers offered by traditional religion, as they seem too abstract and disconnected from the reality of human suffering. For Tolstoy, Faith must be something more, something that addresses the very real, very human experience of existential doubt. It cannot simply be a set of intellectual propositions, but must be an experiential, deeply felt connection to something greater than oneself. The turning point for Tolstoy comes when he begins to realize that faith, rather than being an irrational escape from the harsh truths of existence, might actually provide a deeper understanding of life's meaning. The faith of the Russian peasantry, with its simplicity and purity, provides a striking contrast to the intellectualism and materialism that Tolstoy himself had embraced for much of his life. It is in the lives of these people, whose faith gives them strength to endure hardships that Tolstoy cannot even begin to fathom, that he begins to see a possible path out of his own despair. Their faith is not intellectual or rational, it is lived, embodied, and deeply personal. This is a key insight for Tolstoy. Faith is not about intellectual assent to abstract propositions or theological arguments. It is about something much deeper, something that cannot be easily explained or reasoned away. It is about living in a way that is connected to a higher purpose, something beyond the material and the finite. As Tolstoy contemplates the lives of the peasants, he begins to see that their faith offers them a kind of peace, a peace that he has been unable to find. Despite all his intellectual achievements, for them, faith is not an escape from reality, but a way of engaging with it in a more meaningful and profound way. But even as he begins to glimpse the possibility that faith might offer him an answer to his despair, Tolstoy is still deeply conflicted. His intellectual nature still resists the idea of simply accepting something on faith, especially when it comes to something as grand and abstract as belief in God. He cannot simply shut off his critical faculties and embrace a religious worldview without confronting the many questions and doubts that linger in his mind. For Tolstoy, faith cannot be something that is accepted blindly, it must be something that makes sense, that resonates with the deeper truths of the human experience. This tension between reason and faith is at the heart of Tolstoy's struggle. He cannot easily make the leap from intellectual skepticism to religious faith. However, over time, he begins to recognize that faith is not something that can be fully grasped by reason alone. Faith, in its deepest sense, requires a kind of surrender, a surrender of the need for complete intellectual certainty. This is a difficult and unsettling realization for someone like Tolstoy, who has spent much of his life seeking rational explanations for everything. Yet it is precisely in this surrender, in the willingness to embrace the unknown, that Tolstoy begins to find the peace he has been seeking. In his search for meaning, Tolstoy begins to see that faith is not necessarily about finding definitive answers to all of life's questions, but about accepting the mystery and uncertainty of existence. Faith, in this sense, is not an escape from the void of nihilism, but a way of transcending it. It is a way of finding meaning not in the intellectual answers we can give, but in the way we live our lives, in our relationships with others, and in our connection to the world around us. Faith becomes not a belief in abstract propositions, but a lived experience, one that is deeply connected to the very real struggles and joys of human life. As Tolstoy reflects on this, he begins to understand that faith is not simply a solution to nihilism, it is, in a sense, the only true answer to the existential despair that comes from recognizing the meaninglessness of life. Faith offers a way of living that is grounded in love, compassion, and a connection to something greater than oneself. It is a way of embracing life's mystery and uncertainty, rather than trying to control or explain it. In the end, faith does not give us all the answers, but it provides a way to live meaningfully in the face of life's ultimate unknowability. But Tolstoy's conclusion is not one that is easy for everyone to accept. Faith, as he comes to understand it, is not a simple intellectual choice. It is not something that can be grasped through logical argument or empirical evidence. It is something that comes from within, something that must be lived and experienced. For Tolstoy, the question of faith is ultimately about living in a way that is connected to something greater than oneself, and in doing so, finding a sense of purpose and peace that transcends the existential void. Tolstoy's journey with faith is a deeply personal one, and it is not one that can be easily replicated or understood by everyone. Faith, in the context of nihilism, offers a way to navigate the despair that comes with recognizing the meaninglessness of life. But it is not a universal solution. For some, faith may provide the solace and meaning they seek, while for others, it may remain an elusive and deeply troubling question. In the end, Tolstoy's exploration of faith reveals that the question of meaning, whether through religion, philosophy, or some other means, is one of the most profound and personal questions we can face. It is a journey that each individual must undertake in their own way, and one that does not offer easy answers or quick solutions. In his struggle with nihilism, Tolstoy ultimately finds that faith is not just a remedy for despair, it is the very thing that enables him to live meaningfully in a world that might otherwise seem devoid of purpose. It offers a path out of the darkness, not by offering intellectual answers, but by providing a way to live in the mystery of life itself. Faith, in this sense, becomes a transformative force, one that allows us to transcend the emptiness of existence and find meaning not in what we can explain, but in how we choose to live our lives. In wrapping up our exploration of Tolstoy's journey through the depths of existential despair, we're left with a haunting, yet ultimately transformative realization. The quest for meaning is not a mere intellectual exercise, it's a deeply personal, soul-searching pursuit. Tolstoy's life and writings show us that the questions we face about the meaning of existence are not academic or abstract. They're woven into the very fabric of our daily lives and can't be avoided indefinitely. To confront the void, the terror of meaninglessness, is to confront ourselves, our desires, and ultimately, our place in the world. It's an uncomfortable, sometimes even terrifying endeavor, but it's an essential part of being human. As Tolstoy's Crisis demonstrates, it's easy to fall into the trap of assuming that meaning can be found through external accomplishments or the pursuit of worldly success. He had it all: fame, wealth, literary acclaim, and a loving family, yet none of it provided him with lasting peace. In fact, the more he achieved, the more he felt empty. The truth is, the search for meaning often forces us to turn inward, to question not just the external circumstances of our lives, but the very way we engage with the world and with ourselves. And that's where the rub lies. What happens when everything we've built, everything we've worked for, starts to feel futile? What do we do when the conventional paths we've followed in search of purpose no longer satisfy the deep ache of the soul? This is the paradox of nihilism. The more you acquire, the less fulfilling it becomes. The very pursuit of meaning through external achievements can lead to greater dissatisfaction. And yet, many of us find ourselves caught in this cycle, whether it's through career, relationships, material possessions, or even the pursuit of pleasure. We continue to seek more, hoping that the next thing will finally give us the satisfaction we crave. But as Tolstoy experienced, the void only seems to expand with each new success. This is the trap of desire. It's insatiable, and the deeper we fall into this cycle, the further away we move from finding true fulfillment. In the end, no amount of success, wealth, or pleasure can plug the existential hole we may feel inside. Tolstoy's story is not just a historical account of a famous Russian writer grappling with despair, it's a universal tale, one that mirrors the inner struggles many of us face. In our modern world, where success is often measured by material wealth, career advancement, and social status, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that these things don't guarantee happiness or fulfillment. And even when we achieve them, we're often left wondering, is this all there is? If life is essentially meaningless, what is the point of any of it? But here lies the lesson that Tolstoy teaches us. The search for meaning is not futile, even if it leads us into dark, uncomfortable places. In fact, it may be one of the most vital things we can do. Tolstoy's personal crisis didn't end with a neatly tied-up answer or a philosophical breakthrough. It ended with a kind of surrender, a willingness to accept the mystery of life and to place faith in something larger than himself. It wasn't a simple intellectual conclusion that resolved his questions, but a deeper, more profound shift in perspective. The answer to nihilism, Tolstoy found, wasn't intellectual reasoning or worldly achievements. It lay in the leap of faith, the willingness to surrender to something greater than the limits of human understanding. It's important to note, however, that faith is not an easy or automatic solution to the crisis of meaning. For Tolstoy, the question of faith was far from simple. As a man of reason and intellect, he struggled deeply with the idea of believing in something that couldn't be proven or understood through logic alone. And yet, despite his doubts and intellectual resistance, he came to understand that the search for meaning often requires a leap beyond reason, a leap into something deeper, something that can't be entirely grasped with the mind. Faith, for Tolstoy, wasn't just an intellectual answer, it was a lived experience. A way of being in the world that provided him with a sense of purpose, hope, and meaning in the face of overwhelming despair. This is where the existential challenge becomes deeply personal for each of us. How do we respond when we confront the meaninglessness of existence? Do we ignore it, distract ourselves, and hope it goes away? Do we indulge in pleasure or material pursuits, seeking temporary satisfaction? Or do we face it head-on, as Tolstoy eventually did, with a willingness to question everything and explore faith as a possible answer? These are not just philosophical questions, they are the questions that shape our lives. How we respond to the void, to the existential dilemma, determines not only our philosophy of life, but the very way we experience the world and ourselves. When we face nihilism, we may find ourselves in one of several responses. As Tolstoy himself describes, the first, and perhaps the most common, is ignorance, pretending that everything is fine, that there is no deep emptiness gnawing at us. We bury our feelings with work, pleasure, or distraction, hoping that the existential questions will simply disappear. But, as Tolstoy warns, this approach is only temporary. The existential crisis cannot be ignored indefinitely. Sooner or later, it will rise to the surface, demanding to be addressed. The second response is hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure. The belief that if life has no inherent meaning, the only thing left to do is to enjoy it as much as possible. Tolstoy himself briefly experimented with this response, diving into pleasure-seeking behaviors. But he found that this too was ultimately unsatisfying. The more he sought pleasure, the more fleeting and shallow it became. Eventually, pleasure itself became a hollow pursuit, offering no lasting relief from the deeper questions that plagued him. A third response is despair or self-destruction. This is the tragic outcome for some who, unable to find meaning in life, fall into despair. Some may even turn to self-destructive behaviors or, in the most extreme cases, suicide. This response is a dark and painful one, and yet it too is a search for meaning, a search that has lost its way. But even within despair, there remains the faint glimmer of hope, the sense that if we could just find the right answer, everything would make sense again. The final response, inertia, is perhaps the most insidious. It's the response of going through the motions of life without belief, purpose, or joy. It's a kind of soul death, where we continue to live but without really living. This is the fate that Tolstoy himself feared, and it's a fate that many people experience in our modern, disenchanted world. Life becomes a series of tasks and obligations, a routine that is followed without any real passion or meaning. But the essential point that Tolstoy's crisis teaches us is that confronting nihilism is not about finding the perfect intellectual answer, nor is it about achieving a perfect sense of satisfaction. It's about engaging with the questions, asking ourselves repeatedly what it means to be alive, what it means to be human, and how we can live authentically in a world that sometimes feels indifferent to our existence. For Tolstoy, the answer came in the form of faith, a belief in something greater than himself, a way of connecting with the mystery of existence. This leap of faith did not solve all his problems or remove all his doubts, but it provided him with the strength to continue living with purpose and meaning. As we reflect on Tolstoy's journey and the existential questions that we all face, we are reminded that life's meaning is not something we can passively stumble upon. It is something we must actively seek, and that search requires confronting the very real possibility of meaninglessness. Whether we find that meaning through faith, reason, relationships, or creative endeavors, the key lies in confronting the terror of nihilism head-on. We must face the void, and in doing so, we may find the courage to live a life that is truly ours, one that is meaningful, purposeful, and deeply connected to the mystery of existence. In the end, how we respond to these questions is not just a matter of philosophy. It shapes our very experience of life. And in that experience, we find the answers we've been searching for.